It's always great to see. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may tuning in from. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this special event, Inclusive Approaches to Preventing Violent Conflict, marking the 5th anniversary of the milestone UN World Bank Pathways to Peace report. When Madeleine O'Donnell, standing right over there, first approached me to suggest that we convene this event, to be honest, I thought, wow, it's been 5 years already. The report remains such an important reference for many of us working in this space. But of course, as everyone is no doubt aware, a lot has happened in the last 5 years, and therefore it is altogether fitting to take a moment to consider what enduring lessons we can take from the findings of this report in an evolving global peace, conflict, and geopolitical landscape. And of course, what potentially new conclusions we may draw as we look ahead to the next 5 years and beyond. We have a lot of speakers, great speakers ahead of us to discuss all that in a moment, so I will leave my introduction to that. But I do want to first give thanks to our partners at PBSO and the World Bank for engaging IPI on this very important initiative. Before we move on to our first panel of 2, which will be moderated by Rosalind Akombe, Deputy Director, Peacebuilding Support Office. We will first hear opening remarks, first from Farhad Pekar, Acting Special Representative to the United Nations of the World Bank Group. And then, as you see up on screen, UN Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding Support, Elizabeth Spehar, will introduce a video message from UN Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo. So first, Farhad is here. Welcome, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam. Good morning. ASG Spehar. Thank you so much to you and your team. And of course, let me start also by thanking the International Peace Institute for hosting this very important discussion today. It's an honor to be here. It's good to see so many friendly and familiar faces in the room. It's great to have so many people on a Monday morning. Adam, as you said, the Pathways for Peace report helped change the way the World Bank Group, the United Nations, and many other institutions perceive fragility, conflict, and violence as a critical development challenge that threatened efforts to end extreme poverty in both low and middle-income countries. It has not only made the business case for prevention itself, it also convincingly made the case regarding the importance of development approaches to prevention. It led to consensus on how we can strengthen our collective impact on prevention, how we can work together toward achieving peaceful, inclusive, and sustainable development. The report also clearly laid out the groundwork for the development and adoption of the bank's first ever strategy for fragility, conflict, and violence, or as we go short, FCV. But as we mark its first 5-year anniversary, it is clear that a lot of work remains for all of us. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the world has seen a series of massive setbacks to stability. An additional 20 million people are living in extreme poverty in countries affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. The war in Ukraine is disrupting livelihood, affecting energy and commodity markets, and placing further stresses on areas that were already in fragile states, such as Yemen and the Sahel, among many others, of course. We have also seen rising inequality and intra-state violence and conflict, as well as other emerging threats that have sparked concerns. We need to redouble our effort and adapt to multitudes of risks, which includes not just rising inequality and food insecurity, but also climate change, demographic change, and socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. We need to continue developing our data collection and evidence base. We need to continue to prioritize social, political, and economic inclusion and finance development activities that support peace and stability over the long term. This requires intervention in many areas, including supporting lagging regions, strengthening local governance, improving land management, and creating jobs. To this end, we must continue to work closely with partners across humanitarian development and peace-building spectrum, I mean, like many of you in this room, on finding holistic and complementary approaches and reflecting, adjusting, and adapting as we go along. The UN, with its humanitarian development, peace-building, and political mandate, and of course, its deep field presence, will remain a key partner for the World Bank Group in FCV settings. Since 2016, more than $6 billion in World Bank financing has been implemented in partnership with the UN in over 40 crisis-affected situations. Today's session could not be more a timely opportunity to hear your reflection, identify outcomes for prevention and peace building, and look ahead to future opportunities to enforce shared prevention and peace building. Pathways report rightly predicted the need for prevention, and 5 years on, this message has only become more urgent. We are in the process of evolving the World Bank Group, or as we say, the reform of the World Bank Group, to be able to address global challenges, including fragility, conflict, and violent affected context, by focusing on 3 areas of our work: our vision and mission. And many of you, if you listened to our president who was speaking during the Paris summit, he mentioned that the World Bank is moving to a new mission and vision, and that would be to still focus on extreme poverty, but in a livable planet. So that's the part that he's adding to the playbook that he's starting his new term. We are also working on our operational model and financial capacity. I don't want to talk more about our evolution process. I'm sure you have seen it, but I encourage you all to share your views on the bank's evolution, mainly focusing on FCV in our online consultations, which is actually open until July 31st of this year. The World Bank will continue to support countries that are facing fragility, conflict, and violence, and we are very much looking forward to continuing engaging closely with you as implementation, learning, and partnerships advance. At the end, I want to thank you again and thank you all for coming, for collectively reaffirming, refocusing, and reinvigorating our efforts on prevention. Thank you so much.
Well, now I'll turn to UN Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding Support, Elizabeth Speher, who will introduce a video message from Rosemary DiCarlo. Please.
Great, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me from the screen. I'll be fairly brief. I first of all want to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's part of this wrap-up event on our Pathways for Peace at 5 initiative, both those of you who are in person together at IPI, as well as those of you on screen. I also would like to thank, first and foremost, the International Peace Institute for hosting us today. I also want to thank Farhad and the World Bank for being a strong partner on this initiative from the beginning. We started this earlier in the year. I also want to acknowledge and thank various UN partners for their support in the course of this initiative, in particular the Policy Mediation Division of DPPA, as well as UNDP and DPO. And then finally, our many other partners throughout this initiative of re-looking, taking a second close look at Pathways for Peace 5 years on, which have included a number of you who are here today who contributed very good papers that hopefully we'll be hearing about a bit later, as well as a number of you who have also hosted events throughout these last weeks, which have really built up our knowledge base on the issue of pathways, its continuing relevance, and what we need to do to continue to build on it going forward. So without further ado, and with those very few brief words of thanks, I would like to introduce a video message from USG DeCarlo. Both she and I are unable to be in person with you today, but she very much wanted to be part of this event. So I'm very happy to be ceding the floor to her in a moment so that we can hear her video message. And as a final message from me for the time being, I really do look forward to our discussions today. I look forward to hearing about how many of you have found the earlier meetings that we also hosted or co-hosted throughout the year. And again, to see how we can really build on this knowledge base, particularly in the framework of the soon to be coming out new agenda for peace, and to take advantage of all of the very important policy processes, high-level events, such as the Summit of the Future and others that will be coming up within the UN context in the coming months. So with that, over to the video, and thank you so much again for being here.
Dear colleagues, first of all, I'd like to thank the International Peace Institute, the World Bank, as well as UNDP and DPO for their partnership on this important initiative. The Pathways for Peace report, published in 2018, remains a significant milestone on prevention and sustaining peace for 3 reasons. First, it represented a strong business case for refocusing the international community's attention on conflict prevention. It underscored that a stronger system for preventive action could save billions of dollars per year, which would be better spent on poverty reduction and development. Second, it shone a spotlight on new research on exclusion as a root cause of conflict. The report demonstrated why the inclusion of women, youth, and ethnic and religious minorities was vital to prevention efforts. Third, it sent a strong signal about the shared commitment of the United Nations and the World Bank to tackle these challenges. 5 years later, we are confronting a changed global landscape, one characterized by complex and compounding crises linked to the war in Ukraine and other ongoing conflicts. We feel the effects of climate change and the lingering consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Geopolitical tensions are hampering international cooperation, and the potential malicious uses of new technologies, as well as the spread of mis- and disinformation and hate speech, pose growing risks. As we look ahead to the Sustainable Development Goals Summit, the Secretary General's new agenda for peace, and the Summit of the Future, let us build on the groundwork laid by the Pathways for Peace report. Prevention saves lives and gives a tremendous return on investment. What we need now is greater investment, including from multilateral partners and the private sector. We must focus on inclusive processes as well as more inclusive outcomes for all excluded and underrepresented voices. The United Nations, together with other international partners, has developed the necessary approaches, but we need to sharpen and better employ these instruments. We need to see prevention as a global challenge. I look forward to hearing the outcomes of today's event, including proposals to better support the aspirations of many conflict-affected countries for a more peaceful future. Thank you.
Good morning, Excellencies and colleagues. We are really pleased to be here today, as we've heard from the messages from both the World Bank, IPI, and my 2 bosses. I was almost tempted to say, since my bosses have spoken, the meeting is over. But then I figured Adam will make sure that I don't get coffee at lunch at break time, so I'll continue with the moderation. So I'm stepping in for Assistant Secretary General Speha, who we've been working very hard since I started this job in January to have this event, and unfortunately she's not here in person, but then that gives me the opportunity to be able to moderate and see my good friends around, including former bosses like Under Secretary General Mahmoud and other colleagues. So thank you very much. So we are starting now the first panel, which we have very exciting panelists whom we all know very well, who have been working and writing and sending provocative articles around and opinion ads. So I think it will be very interesting to hear from them. I will not repeat any of the introductory remarks already made by my bosses because they have laid the foundation for the discussion we're going to have. And we've heard from the World Bank where they are heading and how they are looking back at what they have achieved in the last 5 years. And we have several papers that have done the same. So mine will just be simple, to introduce the panelists that we have today and ask them to take the floor. We will also be taking questions from our participants who are here in the room, but also I understand we have online participants, so we will take some questions after that. So we hope that the panelists will be brief enough to allow for interactions from all the participants that we have here. Did I thank you, Adam, again for hosting us? Thank you very much for hosting us. Okay, so we'll start off our first, we have, maybe let me introduce the panelists that we have with us today. So we have Adam Day, who's participating online. You can see him there, and he's online because he's actually the head of the Geneva office of the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. I know we always feel like Adam is right here in New York because he's very much involved in a lot of the work that we do on the policy front, but also been involved a lot on pathways for peace. So Adam is a panelist for us today. And then we have a second panelist, Richard Gowan, who, you know, I'm assuming everybody understood when I say provocative articles, whom I was referring to. Richard Gowan is a UN Director for International Crisis Group, and he'll also give us a short presentation of his work, and I'm sure he'll provoke some reasons for all of us to intervene with more questions and comments along the way. So if you allow me, then I'll pass the floor to Adam. We're giving you the floor first so that in case the internet locks out, we would have had you. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks to IPI and PBSO for this. I'm very happy to be working on this with all of you. 5 years ago, I did do some research for the Pathways report, and I really thought that it was a watershed moment. It wasn't, not everything in it was new, but it really did crystallize some key concepts. And one of the most important, Rosemary actually just mentioned this idea of horizontal inequality being a major driver of violent conflict. And I, to be honest, I've been a little bit surprised that it hasn't become even more central to how we think about our work. And so when Madeline and others came to me to do some thinking about what's changed over the last 5 years and how the UN might take up some of the pathways analysis, I jumped at the chance. And what I'll just do is draw from one of the papers that I worked on, which really looks at the question of what's different 5 years later, what major global trends have changed since that 2018 moment, a little bit drawing on the second paper I did, which has more to do with UN uptake and some of the questions that may arise for how to take some of this forward. So I think we identified several of the biggest shifts since 2018. The pandemic is the most obvious one, this kind of massive social and economic shock. And one of the interesting things is it seems that the pandemic heightened both vertical inequality, so kind of poverty levels, and horizontal inequality across groups, and some indications that the pandemic may have increased a risk in violent conflict too, which you could see through that pathways analysis as well, including by weakening some of the governance capacities in some states. The second big shock is obviously the war in Ukraine, and that kind of part of that deepening geopolitical fracture. I think one of the interesting kind of corollary parts of that we looked at was this: after decades of relative decreases in military spending, Ukraine's triggered an increase. And that could result in a rise in a decrease in the types of social spending that one might imagine would address horizontal inequalities. I think the biggest difference that I see in the Ukraine war is Pathways was all about intrastate conflict, all about civil war. And Ukraine has really got us refocused on a different kind of war, interstate conflict. And I think that it's possible that much of the analysis in leading up to Pathways and Pathways itself may have been overly focused on intrastate dynamics. One of the continuing trends from 2018 is a growth of authoritarianism and kind of right-wing forms of governance and a loss of trust in some institutions. I think that continuing trend and then some of the inflection points we've seen over the last 5 years are very important for that Pathways approach, which has a lot to do with trust between citizens and state and good governance of some of those risks. One of the most interesting points I think also to think about is 2018 was a moment of some real optimism around some of the regions that had been experiencing a lot of conflict. Ethiopia, Eritrea in 2018, the peace deal in South Sudan, possible turning points in Mali. And really the last 5 years, I think, has shown a real limitation in the ability of regional actors to address those kinds of conflicts and a return of conflict in most of the areas that were seen as relatively optimistic in 2018. So there's probably some important lessons there, but I think it's an important trend to pay attention to. Another big trend that we looked at was the recognition that there's a link between food systems, supply chains, and broader risks. And the pandemic really brought that home. But I think that increasingly we're seeing food systems and supply chains as much more integral to conflict analysis than we did before. And similarly, I think a continuation of the understanding that climate change and climate-driven risks, that idea of a threat multiplier, I think that was there in Pathways. It's much more front and center today in terms of how we're looking at security risks. And certainly the way that climate change impacts are unequally distributed plays into that Pathways assessment. And the final trend I think that's worth noting, and it's probably on everyone's phone by now, is the technological advances in ChatGPT and the risks that technological accelerations won't be evenly distributed and could drive different types of conflict. Now that can be a direct AI-driven, leave autonomous weapon systems and things like that, but more indirect as well, that they could lead to greater inequalities. So I think I'd want to just kind of end with several questions that come out of this analysis. And I think the first one is, does Ukraine show that we had a blind spot, or is it a recognition of something deeper? How much is Ukraine really a game changer in terms of the Pathways analysis? Do we need to shift much more on interstate dynamics, or is the Pathways focus on intrastate still the right lens? And how much could those kind of knock-on effects like a shift to military spending be kind of brought into the Pathways framework? I think another one, and I think this will be taken up in the new agenda for peace, is should we be thinking beyond the fragile and conflict affected states paradigm? The pandemic had lots of impacts on middle income countries, lots of newer research showing that conflict is not just in the poor countries that tend to be the focus of the UN. One of the ideas being considered in the new agenda for peace is that more universal approach to prevention. And actually Pathways did call for countries to develop national prevention strategies, which would be a kind of corollary to that. So maybe there's a moment where the kind of Pathways in the new agenda for peace actually come together quite nicely, and we could think about how that could be done. I think another question is, do we need to take climate-driven risks to the next level, given how clear the evidence is? And could Pathways be a way to push climate-driven risks more directly into our prevention work through the Peacebuilding Commission, through the General Assembly, through other bodies, but is now a moment to kind of push some of that a bit? I think one of the things that Pathways certainly offers is a political economy approach to conflict risks, and certainly it's something the bank has taken up, is the Pathways approach. And I just wonder if things like food and water security, as we see them become increasingly the drivers of risks, could that help us refocus on supply chain, food security, and other issues that could be much more central to conflict risks? One of the criticisms I have of Pathways is, and this is a question really, is there too bright a line drawn between vertical and horizontal inequality? Pathways draws that line pretty clearly. My view is those two tend to happen at the same time. Poverty and inequality amongst groups tend to be experienced together. I think that more could be done to link the kinds of inequalities that Pathways was talking about to the SDGs. And there may be a more blended approach that we could take going forward that might reflect reality a bit better. One of the interesting things that came up in our conversations, Rosalind, I think you were there at the time, was is there too much of a focus on some of the excluded groups? And we did an analysis of UN programming that suggests a real increase in programming on youth and women inclusion, which is great and really important, but they're certainly not the only groups that are excluded according to the Pathways analysis. So political groups, religious groups, ethnic groups, other groups could benefit from maybe a bit more focus. And there's an interesting question there about what the future could look like there. And then I think there's an interesting final question, really, which is Pathways talks a lot about a, quote, sense of injustice. And there, I think some of the time we tend to speak fairly euphemistically about things. We talk about inequality amongst groups, but typically that inequality is experienced by those groups as human rights violations or a sense of injustice. And I think that to a certain extent, we need to maybe get beyond the euphemism of inequality and unequal distribution of power and get to the language that those groups might describe it as, which is having their human rights violated. And I think Pathways may be a good way into that, given that it has that emphasis, and it may be an emphasis that we haven't looked at enough, which is a bit more of that rights-based approach to inequality. And so I think there's lots of examples that we've seen of Pathways becoming part of the bloodstream in some ways, but I do think that there's the final point I'll leave you with is I think at the time we thought of Pathways as the thing that was going to bring the World Bank and the UN together at the strategic level. And what I've seen mainly is examples, and there's some from the Sahel where the UN and the World Bank are working very closely together, some in the DRC and other places, but I haven't seen it trigger that much more strategic alignment that we all kind of hoped for. And I hope that the Pathways at 5 process offers an opportunity to come back to that big strategic question of how to get these two organizations linked at the head and the hip. So thanks very much for the chance to offer some of these thoughts, and looking forward to hearing from the other folks in the room.
Thank you very much, Adam, for those points and for explaining, going a bit beyond actually the paper that you had prepared in giving us more details and more nuance to it. So thank you very much. And the questions you raised are important. And I'm looking at Farhad and I'm like, we need to do another report to answer some of those questions he has raised. But good points. And I know that especially on the issues of exclusion of other communities, we are very pleased to have the Deputy permanent representative of Colombia, who I know is a strong advocate for issues related to inequality, especially of indigenous communities. So she will be on a panel later on. Hopefully she can give us more insight into that. And on that note, having seen the evolution globally, we're going to move to Richard Gowan, who is going to give us a bit more of the region per region analysis and sharing experiences, obviously building from the broad network that the International Crisis Group has, but his own network. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. And as always, it's a pleasure to speak after Adam, who you should note is advertising his book very prominently, immediately behind him. And you should read it. It's so good that it seems to be the only thing he reads, judging by the state of his bookshelves. But I would thoroughly recommend that. Okay, so there are certain other things which Adam has written that he also reads, but it's a pleasure to be here today. Rosalind suggested I was sort of here as some sort of anarchist bomb thrower in her initial remarks, but actually I'm very much here to share some ideas from my colleagues at the International Crisis Group, and especially our colleagues who work on individual regions. Crisis Group has 5 regional programs covering Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East and North Africa. And late last year, Madeleine O'Donnell approached us asking what we could contribute to a reflection on Pathways for Peace. And I suggested that we should simply interview the heads of the different regional programs to ask them, firstly, what has been the trend in conflict over the last 5 years? And secondly, do they think that the Pathways diagnosis of exclusion and inclusion as central to conflict and conflict prevention stands up to scrutiny when put in the context of what they're seeing in the region they cover? Out of that, we produced quite a lengthy analysis. I won't try and summarize all the findings. I think the key point on trends is that in every region we look at, things seem to be getting worse in terms of conflict, but things are getting worse in different ways in different regions. So in Latin America, interstate conflict and even classic civil wars are no longer really a challenge to most states. But organized crime and violence associated with organized crime continues to rise. By contrast, in Europe, as Adam said, we have seen a return to old-fashioned interstate war as the main driver of loss of life. In Africa, we see a number of drivers of conflict, but one of the most concerning, and one that has been on our minds due to the situation in Mali in recent weeks, is that in the Sahel, we're seeing a very rapid expansion of transnational jihadist groups who are now not only dominating large areas of the Sahel, but starting to move into the coastal West African states. And so in different regions, we see different conflict trends. To what extent can we explain these trends in terms of exclusion and inclusion? Well, here again, my colleagues had very differing responses by region. Our Latin America director, Ivan Briscoe, and his deputy, Renata Segura, strongly supported the Pathways' emphasis on exclusion and inclusion. They emphasized that there are many people in Latin America who feel excluded either for reasons of economics or reasons of identity. And actually that sense of exclusion was significantly sharpened during the pandemic because many communities felt strongly that their governments were letting them down. By contrast, our Europe director, Olga Olica, was very skeptical of the exclusion-inclusion analysis. And she warned us about taking it too literally because she pointed out that Vladimir Putin has used the language of exclusion and used arguments about exclusion of Russian speakers in Ukraine to justify a war that is clearly not in the end about the inclusion of Russian speakers in Ukraine. It is about good old-fashioned geopolitics and imperial pretensions. Our Asia director, Pierre Prakash, took a middle line. He said, yes, in Asia, you can clearly see there are local conflicts where inclusion and exclusion are central to violence. I mean, if you want a good example, although it's an example that has blown up since we did the interview, look at Northeast India, look at Manipur. In Manipur, we have a sudden outbreak of localized violence, which is largely driven by a contest between different ethnic groups about who should be included in certain legal frameworks and have certain economic opportunities. It's a pretty classic example of the sort of exclusion-inclusion challenge. But, says Pierre, if you're sitting in Asia and if you're a security analyst now, you're not really focusing on those issues. You're focusing on this thing called China, and you're focusing on the rise of competition between China and the US, and the risk that competition between China and the US will lead to much broader regional rifts and regional conflicts. So in some regions, this analysis works. In some regions, it works less well, and sometimes it sort of is part of the story. That said, as I was preparing for today's remarks, I sort of thought a little bit about some of the major conflicts that have been at the top of our minds in UN land in recent months, and wondered, could we apply the Pathways framework to them? Sudan is obviously at the top of all our minds. And in Sudan, it is clear that in 2019, we saw a youth movement overthrow the previous government, primarily out of a sense of grievance over a lack of economic opportunities. This was a popular revolution driven by a sense of exclusion. And I think that the overall situation in Sudan can be explained very much in terms familiar to pathways. Unfortunately, maybe because we didn't try hard enough, or maybe because it was beyond our control, that conflict has now collapsed into a classic battle between elites. And I think we should look back at the Sudan story, and we should ask if there was a moment where we could have intervened with more resources, politically or economically, to facilitate a real transition to civilian rule, rather than regressing into a situation where essentially we have two power-hungry lunatics fighting for control of the country. If you look at Mali, again, what we see in Mali is an elite that has come to power through a coup, now attempting to force the UN out of the country. But underlying that is a massive sense of exclusion amongst many Malians, and indeed many people across the Sahel, who feel they have very little economic opportunity, who feel that democracy has largely failed them. And I suppose the question for us now is there any way in the Sahel to try and reach out to those communities that feel excluded and try and build a new base for peace and security? Or are we going to be trapped in a world where it's only actors like the Wagner Group, if the Wagner Group is still a thing, and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb that can win loyalty? I would, by the way, say what we saw in a certain P5 country over the weekend is a very good example of what happens when you don't build an inclusive economy and you hand all the resources to elites who then fight it out. But I don't think we'll go into that in any more detail. So I think we think the analysis is broadly right, but the challenge is how do we move beyond just juggling the interplay between elites for control of power? One final point I'd like to make is that actually in our conversations, I was very struck by a rather dark narrative that came out. And the dark narrative was, yes, many elites in many regions do understand that the exclusion of minorities is a likely source of disruption and conflict in their countries. They buy that analysis. But their response is not to be inclusive. Their response is to be repressive. Their response is to try and surveil and crack down on those who are being excluded. Especially, frankly, in the Arab world, a lot of elites have taken a lesson from 2011 that the last thing you need to do is give the people a chance to be part of power. You want to crack down on them. You want to exclude them. And I do rather worry that in some areas, there are governments that are using exclusion, frankly, as a conflict prevention mechanism, using repression as a conflict prevention mechanism, and betting that that will work. Although, as I think we've seen time after time, it generally doesn't.
Thank you very much, Richard, for keeping to the time and sharing with us experiences, at least from how it's perceived from different regions. Thank you very much. And I think we'll go back to some of the examples and details that you have provided. But before we do that, I'm going to turn to a few respondents who are here with us in the room, but also some of them who are participating virtually, who've really helped us in the last 6 months as we've been working on Pathways for Peace by convening different groups together and different regions together. And I'll start with the Deputy Permanent Representative of Switzerland, who together with Colombia and Ghana really were the first to launch this reflection on pathways at 5. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Good morning. Now the mic works, and thanks a lot for having me address you with a few words on the event and the inclusive approaches to preventing violent conflicts. Switzerland in February 2023 was very pleased to co-host, together with the permanent missions of Colombia and Ghana, DPR Breakfast kickoff event on the 5th anniversary of the publication of the flagship UN World Bank report, Pathways for Peace, and would really like to thank the International Peace Institute, the World Bank Group, PBSO and DPPA for their remarks, and also the panelists for your extremely interesting insights. They come in a time when, as Adam mentioned, we're very actively following the process of the new agenda for peace, as it's being elaborated as we speak. We really look forward to that publication. I think it should be in early July. And Switzerland, as a Security Council member, also is following that with a particular interest. Also, as one of our priorities during our council term is sustainable peace. I would just remind you that we organized in the beginning of May an open debate on the topic of trust building and future-proofing trust based on inclusion, data, and norms. And with norms, we meant also, of course, human rights. So I think Adam's comments were quite interesting and that you made on the Pathways to Peace report. So we definitely will follow up during our remaining mandate and term on these topics and try to sync it with the new agenda for peace. But we very much welcome the approach undertaken by the UN and World Bank to look back at the findings of the 2018 report. I think these were very interesting inputs we heard this morning. We think the approach is refreshing. The discussions show that we don't need to always reinvent the wheel, but maybe come back to some of the basics that are there. And I think that's also one of the focuses of the new agenda for peace. I think back in February at our breakfast kickoff meeting, there was a general feeling that the findings might still be very relevant, and some topics such as climate change and security might have further gained in importance. And I think the discussion today showed that issues such as exclusion and inequality remain very pressing and urgent. So going forward, Switzerland remains a strong supporter of the report and its findings, and we really try to build on this agenda and will advocate for a higher profile of inequality and exclusion in the new Agenda for Peace agenda and the SDG Summit. And I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, thanks for hosting us and kicking off this initiative for us. And we appreciate your leadership in the Security Council on these issues. Thank you very much. And for those who are online, if you could start posting some of your questions, that will be much appreciated so that we can read them out. And for those in the room, just prepare some of the questions that you might have. We might not have enough time, but at least we can check the questions. We have Ambassador Hamed Abdel Latif of the Cairo Center that we've been working with very closely. He is participating online, and we'll pass the floor to him. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you to IPI for hosting us and for the UN and the World Bank to have brought us together in this 5-year anniversary of Pathways for Peace. So as CCCPA, we're African Union Center of Excellence on Peace and Security. We're also the Secretariat of the Aswan Forum for Sustainable Peace and Development, and also recently designated as the first chair of the African Union Think Tanks for Peace Network, Net for Peace. So we hosted on 21st of March the Africa consultations on the 5 years of Pathways for Peace, and with very good participation from the African Union, the REX and REMS, and the African Development Bank, and a number of think tanks. And we had a very fruitful discussions on really, the changing dynamics. So a couple of key messages that came out of that, again, conscious of time. First, one of the big changes since the report impacting African countries is this what we call the poly crisis. I mean, the convergence of on a large scale of interconnected crises that really bring together the fallout of geopolitical tensions, COVID-19, climate, armed conflict, unprecedented surge of terrorism. So all this really makes a very complex security landscape where that is even more challenging than before in terms of prevention. What remains as a key challenges in Africa in terms of implementing, taking forward effective prevention is the weakness of capacities, both at the level of institutions, at the community level, And really, these are key to be able to build adequate and strong abilities to cope with crisis and to be resilient. Inclusion needs to be at the core of peace building, and we see the countries that have not relapsed in conflict have been able to focus on this aspect, in particular through meaningful participation of women and youth at all stages of the peace continuum. And then I think in terms of the investment of prevention, I think that there much more can be done to strengthen the synergies, the complementarities between a range of instruments that we have to address fragility and risks, and that remain still quite fragmented. So there's a huge still capacity to be able to take that forward. Finally, there remains a big gap. The African Union has developed strong prevention architecture and early warning system, but again, it's the implementation that remains the challenges, notably because of capacity gaps, because of the changing nature of conflict dynamics. And this is something that requires continuous to be addressed by a variety of actors. So the summary of the consultation is available, will be available on our website soon. It will also feed into the next edition of the Aswan Forum that really focused on this issue on prevention since the start. One idea that I would also like to throw in this discussion in terms of the change regarding the first report is all this dynamic regarding sovereignty. The report, the first report talked about prevention and interconnected world, and since then we have a return of hardening of sovereignty. And one of the ideas that came out of the consultation that was also in the Aswan Forum, which is that prevention can be a sovereignty enhancer. And this is something that is an idea that we need to further pitch and be persuasive of in terms of the actors that are involved in some of these conflicts that have been mentioned. So I think there's still a huge scope of work to be done in terms of taking forward the ideas and recommendations of the report against this changing landscape that we have seen, particularly in the African context. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I know it's a lot to ask you to summarize in a short time the views of over 54 African countries. So thank you so much for that. And, Madeleine and colleagues from the World Bank, you see, more cases are being made for why we should be having another report. But I know those who went through that process of drafting the 2018 report would not agree with me, given how painful it was. I only had the pleasure of selling it after it had all been written. And on that note, calling on to the podium our colleagues from the United Nations Development Program, because they understand the pain we all went through while working on that report, but it was worth it because it's not on the file. We are still talking about it 5 years on. So my brother, Musa Ibrahim, you have the floor representing the International Dialogue for Peace Building and State Building. Thank you very much.
On 5th May, the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building, we organized a consultation between the INCAF, OECD, G7+, and a consortium of civil society organizations. We had a report which is prepared and we shared it, and we are happy to share it again. I just go quickly through the main readout of the consultation. The first one, still the recommendations valid, but one challenge they brought up is how to translate them effectively into implementation. The second point they discuss is the HDP nexus, and they think that still there is a continuous challenge of crowding out development investment by increasing humanitarian spending. Third, they discuss issue of achieving necessary scale and speed about inclusive collaboration across all levels by promoting mutual accountability, elevating impact, and contributing to capacity development, and more effectively documenting and sharing results. Fourth, an issue discussed was early warning, early response, and anticipation. And they think that still there is a gap in building consensus on early action among partners, which continue to be a major challenge. They also discussed localization and development of national action plans in an inclusive manner, which is important for localization, and there is limited access to resources and capacities still continue to impede partners and civil society to promote more effective local approaches. They also discuss inclusive national development and prevention plans that needs to be supported and developed to promote prevention and peace building. And lastly, we discussed the importance of joint dialogue between national partners and civil society to foster inclusive collaboration and civic engagement for peace. The report is ready and we are happy to share it at any time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You stuck to the 2 minutes. Thank you. And very good, clear outcomes. And the report, as Musa has said, is available for you to read. We now have, I think, in the room with us, Cedric Conning, who many of us know and have worked with before, from NUPI, with whom we worked closely to have consultations with the European region, if I may use that term. Over to you, Cedric.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. And yeah, NUPI had the pleasure of hosting a European consultation on 4 April. So sharing some key takeaways with you. I think everybody there agreed that the Pathways report made an important contribution that laid a foundation that is still relevant today. But many also recognize the need, or rather that we are in a very significantly different world with more complex risks and more compound dynamics, and therefore that we need a fundamental rethink of how external actors and international organizations understand peace and what they can do to help prevent conflict and sustain peace. And I'll share 3 key recommendations. First, the need to change the way we think about peace. We need to move beyond old paradigms that are no longer performing. Hiba Casas from the Principles for Peace Foundation pointed to 3 common shortcomings in contemporary peace processes, namely that they are not sufficiently inclusive, that they are not sufficiently transformative. In other words, we are dealing often with only symptomatic issues. We fail to really transform the drivers of conflict, and that they lack popular legitimacy. Adam Day, that we heard from already, argued that we need to move away from the fragility, conflict, and violence paradigm, because in today's context, all countries should pay attention to prevention and invest in sustaining peace domestically, not only those who are in the so-called FCV paradigm. He also called for more focus on horizontal, or that we also called for not only focusing on horizontal inequality, but that we need to focus more on vertical inequality as well. Secondly, the need to be more holistic. And I think this speaks to what Ambassador Latif mentioned when he spoke about convergence, and also when Musa spoke about the nexus. It implies that we need to develop a whole of society approach when it comes to weaving together these various thematic areas to help generate social transformation. And it requires mechanisms and processes that can help a wide range of actors across multiple scales to self-organize around shared visions and goals, such as the SDGs. Gary Milante from CIPRI came with one very specific recommendation, namely that maybe we should introduce a peace-building cluster at country level, similar to the way the humanitarian community use clusters like water and sanitation or health to coordinate themselves. And then lastly, the need to be more people-centered and participatory. Most of our international, regional, and national institutions are locked into state-centric models that turn a blind eye to the reality that some state institutions have been captured by elites and that these institutions often serve only a small percentage of a given country's population, often in the immediate vicinity of the capital and other major centers. And this politics of exclusion and marginalization and the grievances that emerge is well captured in the Pathways for Peace report, but it's difficult to see how we have changed our behavior as international organizations as a result. The UN, the World Bank, and other IFIs and bilateral donors need to understand that working with and through such governments generates legitimacy for them that helps to entrench and perpetuate the very inequalities and exclusions that the Pathways report informs us needs to be addressed to prevent future instability and conflict. In order to address these horizontal and vertical inequalities, more support may need to be channeled in new and innovative ways to civic organizations, social institutions, and other forms of social governance that emerge to address these shortcomings that result from state neglect. And more initiatives need to be directed at subnational authorities, including maybe provincial, county, municipal, village, and community-led institutions, so that our overall efforts strengthen decentralization and local governance that is closer to the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cedric, for those points and for emphasizing again the importance of ensuring that exclusion is not reinforced by institutions that are captured by the elite, what in other parts of the world we call state capture. I will recall the huge South African Commission on State Capture, but it's really, really very good points made there. We're now going to move to West Asia, and we had our colleagues from ESCWA who are based in Beirut, who organized a session that brought together academics and others in that part of the world. And we have our colleague Yusuf Shaitani.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Greetings, everyone from Beirut. Some of quick takeaways from our regional consultations here on the Arab region. Experts noted that the Arab region has experienced an overall increase in conflict-related risks since 2010. They expressed concerns about several Arab states being caused in a no peace, no war situation. These contexts are characterized by no peace settlement or reconciliation, occasional violence, no return of refugees or IDPs, widespread humanitarian needs, and the proliferation of non-state actors controlling significant swathes of territory. Many non-state actors have become involved in illicit trade, while war economies continue to grow. These trends impose immense socioeconomic pressures on populations, hindering peace building and making recovery difficult, if not impossible. Additionally, they pose significant security and social challenges for the entire region. Experts stress the significance of establishing a people-centered approach with a focus on strengthening public institutions and the rule of law. The importance of incorporating risk monitoring and prevention methodologies within national development policies was also emphasized. The integration ensures proactive measures are in place for sustainable peace building and recovery, effectively identifying and addressing potential threats. Here again, the issue of capacity, building capacity, was heavily underscored within national development actors as well as national state institutions. Participants highlighted the need for building trust between governments and their citizens, and people have lost faith in the ability of political processes to bring about change or improve their lives, exclusion or otherwise. Experts highlighted the need for stronger cooperation at regional and international levels, and here again, the issue of the way the multilateral system basically does its operations remains unchanged. And this is basically some of the constructive criticisms that we have received, unlike basically the manner in which trends in this part of the world are emerging, again, to the issue of no peace, no war trend that is more or less becoming a dominant feature here. Experts underscored the need to move away from siloed approaches. This was mentioned earlier by a colleague, that separate humanitarian development and peacebuilding efforts, given the protracted nature of conflicts in the region and the increased number of people relying on humanitarian assistance. I think there's an estimate about 60 million people are dependent on some form of humanitarian assistance in the Arab region. A more holistic and integrated approach is necessary. It was acknowledged that sustained engagement should not be limited to project life cycles. Again, another criticism, basically. And this, I tried as much as possible to condense this in the 2 minutes we were given. We have a report ready that we will share with you and to basically feed into your consultations. Over to you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much.
For those concise remarks and the emphasis on no peace, no war situation and how important it is to address them. And not a surprise that coming from the Economic Commission, you focus on addressing the what we call the nexus between peace, development, and humanitarian and human rights aspects. So thank you very much. Last but not least, in terms of our respondents, very key player that we work with very closely on all matters, peace, security, and development. And, you know, if you don't know, they have a very nice place where we always have conversations around on issues of prevention. And we have our colleague representing civil society who organized a session with us from the Quaker UN House, and that is Kavita Desai. I hope that makes Adam feel really good that we do have a representation of women on the panel. Over to you, Kavita.
Thank you, Rosalind, and thanks to IPI, PBSO, and the World Bank for convening this discussion. On June 12th, the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, and the Quaker UN Office co-hosted a discussion to reflect upon the current international architecture for prevention 5 years after the release of the Pathways Report. We also discussed opportunities to strengthen this architecture through capacity building for inclusive, comprehensive, and participatory risk assessment. I'll focus today on 5 opportunities and action points that emerged from the conversation and within 2 minutes. So first is the forthcoming new agenda for peace, which presents the opportunity to strengthen peace building and prevention and incorporate innovation. Though it is being developed in a challenging environment, it is encouraging to see member states agreeing on the need to focus on prevention. The agenda can help us put prevention back at the heart of the UN's work. Second is the follow-up to last year's resolution on financing for peace building. The resolution creates space for discussions and action to achieve more impactful and prevention-focused financing strategies. It is critical that we have financing that's flexible enough to improve evidence bases and informed by perspectives of civil society. Third is strengthening existing data tools and coordination among them. This includes regional monthly reviews, along with recovery, peace building assessments, early warning mechanisms, and other analytical tools. The fourth opportunity and action point is to continue reflecting on collecting data and good practices. Most successful national programs focus on both short-term incentives of actors and longer-term issues of strengthening institutions and addressing some areas around exclusion and inclusiveness. As we develop evidence bases, it's critical that they build off each other, talk to each other, and partner together. Fifth and final is strengthening early warning and early response systems. Bringing a data collection approach to EWER will strengthen current mechanisms, while it is also necessary to recraft current indicators and development to reflect new and emerging challenges such as climate change. Partnering with civil society is critical in building national infrastructures for peace and recognition of the many roles they play. We've appreciated hearing from other consultations that have happened and look forward to hearing from others as we move forward in this work. And a more comprehensive summary is also available at the back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Super efficient and within the time limit, and very good points, especially around opportunities that exist that we can capitalize to move forward the prevention and peace building agenda. just maybe to flag also that we are working very closely with several civil society organizations and with the support of Finland and advice from Colombia, actually, on a civil society initiative where we will be bringing together different organizations, networks, working on various issues of peace building and sustaining peace. And our first session, we've had a core group meeting where we've been exploring how to move forward, and we have several UN agencies, funds, and programs. I see UNHCR in the room and UNDP and others. And we'll be having a first convening of that group in October. And hopefully we can get many of you to participate, and those who cannot participate, at least give us the money to be able to convey it. Thank you very much. And now we have questions. It's time for us to take some questions. We have one question online, and I think we have a few hands, but we will take the 3 questions and then we will respond to them collectively. We'll take 3 questions from the floor. I am not going to decide who's going to take the mic. I leave it, since Amanda has the mic, whoever she gives the mic is the one that speaks.
Thanks so much, Ross. My name is Henk-Jan Brinkman. I'm the permanent observer of the International Development Law Organization. But I have to admit that I was involved in Pathways for Peace, so I'm a little bit biased. And we don't need another report, please. Very happy to hear the reference to prevention is sovereignty enhancing. But my question is this. So one of the trends that Pathways for Peace identified is the increasing involvement of external actors in civil wars, which is really one of the problems that make the context much more complex and much more protracted. So my question is this: can Ukraine be identified as one of those situations where started as a civil conflict with, of course, external actors that maybe, were political actors and stimulating the perceptions around exclusion, rather than political entrepreneurs inside the country, which is one thing that Pathways for Peace identified? Or should it really be seen as an interstate conflict? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Henk-Jan. Okay.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for the very pertinent and interesting presentations. Giovanni Basso, I'm the deputy of UNHCR's office here in New York. And I mean, one thing I can put to the table that has changed since the report is that we have 35 million more refugees. We were at 75. We broke the sad barrier of 100 million. And you might have seen since the launch of our Global Trends report, we're now at 110, including the displacement stemming from Sudan. So how does this pertain to the analysis of the original report? Well, initially, I mean, from the start of UNHCR, we fully align with the analysis of inclusion exclusion. And we firmly believe that the inclusion of refugees plays up to 2 sides, plays up to the prevention side and plays up to the strengthening of the peace building process side. On the prevention side, obviously an inclusion of a refugee population or the return and inclusion of the returnees international society is going to strengthen prevention efforts. On the peace building side, and this is a relatively newer analysis, and I think Colombia actually is a very, very good example of this on how to include those that were forced to flee because of the civil conflict into the overall peace process and into the kind of overall thinking of their return. So I think there are 2 elements that really should be strengthened in the analysis. And this is an issue that we are working with the World Bank very closely with. And in fact, talking about new reports, the new WDR is focused on human mobility and really highlights the benefits of inclusion here. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those points, UNHCR, and I'm sure we'll respond to them.
Okay, thank you very much. I am Sarah Deval, defender. I'm a civil society activist from Cameroon. I am one of those that the International Crisis Group in Cameroon will always interview about the work we do and how we see what can be done. And you have made mention about other countries, how they started in Africa, Mali, Sudan, and you haven't made mention of Cameroon. Cameroon is still at that point where it can be handled. So as civil society activists, we look more on prevention than resolution. And now, nothing is said about Cameroon. So I want us to look at how Cameroon, the situation of Cameroon can be handled before it goes out of hand. Yes, we have external factors, people from external that influence what is happening within Cameroon. But I think that if we are intentional about prevention, then we should start looking at the case of Cameroon, preventing it from getting worse than what it is. And what we do as peace builders, we have this, we use a tool that we call the outcome harvesting, how we look at the work that we do to evaluate the progress that we make, in the sense that peace building is not quantitative, it is qualitative. And so we start harvesting how people change, the behaviors of people based on the advocacy that we do on the ground, how people react. At first, the separatists will kidnap a woman and they will kill. But based on certain of our advocacy that we have been doing, a parliamentarian, a senator, a lady was kidnapped and she was released. So we know that irrespective of the fact that there is still crisis, people's mentalities are being changed based on the advocacy that we do. And because also you made mention that in Sudan, it started with youths that were disgruntled. It's the same problem we have in Cameroon, because a group of persons, a group of the Southwest and Northwest are saying they are being marginalized because state resources are not equally divided. So I think we should start looking at how to put Cameroon on the table to start preventing, maybe doing livelihood support to youth so that they are not radicalized, but they have something doing. And then we start focusing on how to build back the peace that we so need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, really, for bringing up the practical question of Cameroon, and I hope our panelists will be able to respond. I think we'll now turn to the panelists. We'll give you a minute to try and respond to the various questions that have been asked. But on an exceptional basis, I'm also going to ask Ambassador Abdel, Abdel Latif, since you mentioned the issue of sovereignty, if you want to come in just for a second to link it to the question that Henkian asked at the beginning. But Adam, shall we start with you?
I can be very time efficient because I don't think any questions were actually directed right at me, but this idea of sovereignty enhancement is a really interesting one. I mean, I remember it from the responsibility to protect times as well. And I think it's a matter of unpacking the concept in a way that is meaningful to governments who are worried about having their agendas securitized. And this is one of the reasons I brought up some of the terminology of pathways around a sense of injustice and how grievances are experienced. It could be a useful framing that could get us closer to those issues. I think what doesn't work is if we get too close back to the responsibility to protect type of language. And so I think it's an interesting conversation to have, which is how do governments that have a long history of intervention in them feel about the phrase sovereignty enhancing, and do they feel that that's meaningful to them? Because it sounds kind of good in a meeting like this, but I'm not sure how good it sounds to the government of Mali to be told that their having their sovereignty enhanced by peace building initiatives. So I think it's a great question. It's a great topic, and hopefully IPI hosts another conversation on it. Thank you.
Thank you
Sorry,
very
thank you.
much. Sorry?
Sorry, there may have been an echo, but Rosalind, did you say there was a question for me? I didn't, there was something that was echoed.
No, I was expressing deep appreciation for
Okay,
giving us another topic for Adam from IPI to convene us to discuss. I have a specific question that we got online that we will pass on to Richard Gowan to respond to.
Okay, I'll start with the online question. It's from Christos. He says, hello. Do you think that frozen conflicts are beginning to become active again due to the recent war in Ukraine? And what is your opinion on leaders, elites such as Assad that are seeking recognition from the international community? I mean, on frozen conflicts, we had already seen the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict burn back to life before Russia's all-out aggression against Ukraine. I think there is some evidence that that conflict intensified again last year because the parties were fighting while Russia was distracted. But in some other cases, we've actually seen conflict risks probably go down. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, it looks like the leaders of Republika Srpska have backed off a confrontation because they have realized that Russia is not going to be there to help them if they get into a mess. On leaders and elites such as Assad, I mean, this comes back to my closing point in my initial remarks, which is we do see many governments and their outside supporters essentially backing repression and backing repressive leaders. And that, you know, if you look at Syria, the lesson you take away is that if you just keep fighting and if you just keep killing people, then you can hold on to power. Frankly, if you look at Ethiopia, you learn the lesson that if you win a victory on the battlefield, as the government forces did against the TPLF, then you can, you know, essentially shape peace on your terms. I think we have to be very realistic that there are some examples and precedents out there now for strong arm, iron fist approaches to security challenges. And, you know, I'm very glad there are a lot of reports coming out because Adam has some shelves to fill, but I'm not sure that our reports are necessarily going to have the impact of some of those precedents, and that is very troubling. Henk-Jan, on Ukraine, look, there are many different explanations for what happened in 2014 and the extent to which the 2014 conflict in Donbass was endogenous or exogenous. But what I would say is that from 2014 to 2022, we spent a lot of time, and our colleagues in the OSCE spent a lot of time trying to think about how you could resolve the Donbass situation, you know, through gradual, slow peacemaking efforts, in some ways analogous to what you can find in Pathways for Peace. It was about trying to sort of find some way to include the Russian speakers back into the Ukrainian framework. Now, that could have gone on indefinitely, but what we learned at the end of the day was that it was quite irrelevant, because what mattered was Vladimir Putin's calculation that he could win a quick geopolitical victory. And in so doing, that basically blew away all the previous peacemaking efforts. And that should leave us, I think, quite humble about what we can achieve through trying to build up inclusion. On refugees and migrants, the only thing I would add is we should be very conscious how climate-induced migration is going to add to the sheer burden of displacement that you're describing, and how we still don't really have the rules, mechanisms, or concepts to deal with that. And that's a challenge both for HCR, but also IOM. But I mean, the numbers are just terrifying in terms of climate-induced migration. And then on Cameroon, I don't have anything immediately to add to the very powerful comments. But I think that the speaker's point that sometimes the effect of peace building is to gradually mitigate behavior and gradually change how Conflict Parties Act is incredibly important and is very much in line with Pathways for Peace, which pointed out that the road to peace is usually quite bumpy and not a straight line, as some thought in the 1990s. And I thoroughly endorse the idea that we should be focusing on the need to prevent further conflicts in Cameroon while it is still possible.
Thank you very much, Richard. Ambassador Abdel Latif, just 1 minute.
Thank you. With this provocative a bit, prevention is a conflict enhancer, throws back to really the issue of change of mindset and culture in the political elites that Richard mentioned. If the political elites are keen on sovereignty, are wary of external intervention, then the timely undertaking, timely conflict prevention as a national state-led effort is a sovereignty or can be a sovereignty enhancer. So it's really a bringing from the other end of the equation and prompting a mindset shift in the political elite and how they see conflict prevention, not something that is a burden on coming from outside, but rather as a savior and a way to assert national ownership of these efforts. So that and it would apply to several conflicts ongoing in Africa. Thank you.
Thanking all our panelists and all our respondents for really an interesting conversation, and really sorry, Amanda, for running late. So we shall be taking a break. Unfortunately, we've eaten into our time, so you'll only have 5 minutes for coffee. I take full responsibility for taking away your coffee, but let's come back in 5 minutes. That's going to be 10:26 back into the room. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure now to help you and prepare you for the discussion that is forthcoming. And we're going to have a panel that is focusing on the perspective of other multi-stakeholders on exclusion and inequality. And in order to prepare us for this conversation, we have a little short video that PBSO and the Search for Common Ground have prepared that draws on interviews with peacebuilding activists in Burundi, Niger rather, and Yemen. Maybe without further ado, we could watch the video.
Puisque le conflit il est différent de la violence et que le conflit il est inévitable mais la violence non. Que le conflit peut être une opportunité entre deux groupes pour un changement constructif pour aboutir au résultat gagnant.
Parmi les histoires impactantes, je signalerai que durant ces 5 dernières années, nous avons permis une implication des jeunes dans la résolution pacifique des conflits communautaires avec la participation des différents groupes, y compris la police. Autre agenda mis en avant est le renforcement de la participation socio-économique des jeunes et des femmes, avec un effort de réduire le chômage et chercher un terrain d'équité entre les hommes et les femmes. En ce qui est de l'accès aux opportunités économiques, bien que le travail sur les normes doit se poursuivre.
Il est bon d'intégrer nous, les femmes, dans la résilience, puisque sans la femme, je ne crois pas avoir une vie à la norme. Et sans la femme, l'homme ne sera pas au complet, puisque ce que dit l'adage, la femme est le complément de.
We have learned that young people are able, young people are the engine of change. They can change any kind of situation. So if they are given a place, so that they can contribute.
On a mis en œuvre effectivement beaucoup de choses dans le cadre des projets, comme les sessions de dialogue inter- et intracommunautaire, les formations en approche common ground à l'endroit des jeunes, des femmes, de la communauté dans son ensemble pour la prévention et la gestion des conflits. Donc, on a mis aussi en place des AGR pour les groupes de jeunes et des femmes dans les communes d'intervention. Toutes ces interventions ont eu un impact, en tout cas réel.
Security is a common need for all the communities, and because it's a common need, there is a common interest between security apparatus and communities to make it work. And using that as an entry point for peace and stability has been always a great way to do it. We've seen it on the ground, and we see how effective is that. And by enabling communities and security to talk and discuss and manage the perception and expectation, you could actually build a stronger security for communities.
They all share this premise that inclusion of diverse actors in peace-building efforts, which is basically what we're talking about here at this event, allows for more promising alternatives for lasting and sustainable solutions to violent conflict, as compared to these more top-down approaches. So there's general agreement that inclusion is important, worthy in itself, and potentially, a source of lasting and sustainable peace. And yet, I think inclusion not only of diverse social actors, customarily excluded from public debate, but also more importantly, potentially of diverse ideas and discourses about peace, continue to fall short of their transformative capacity when we talk about peace building. So I want to take this idea to talk about Colombia, which again has been held up as an example. Giovanni mentioned the consultations with victims, displaced persons in particular, of our conflict. I want to suggest that in general, the country's most recent peace building efforts that date back to the 2016 peace accord offer an interesting example of attempts at a more robust and genuine inclusion at various levels. And by this, I mean to say that I don't think inclusion means just one thing in the context of Colombian peace building efforts. By way of general introduction, I want to suggest that both the 2016 peace agreement with FARC and subsequent efforts under the umbrella that the Petro government is calling total peace share a view of inclusion that has several components. I'm not going to talk through all of them because there won't be enough time, but I want to name them. The first is that inclusion is victim-centered, meaning victims are very much the core of all efforts of peace building in the country. Second, gender transformative and intersectional, which is something that was introduced, I'll talk about in a moment, into the 2016 Accords. Third, the view of inclusion is sensitive to the needs and voices of Indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples. I don't feel I'm in the capacity to speak only of Indigenous issues, seeing that my PR is an Indigenous leader, which was, unfortunately, she couldn't be with us, but I think this is a key component of our view of inclusion. Fourth, the idea of inclusion is also territorial differentiated. Colombia's conflict has evolved in varied ways in different parts of the national territory. Different relations between both civil society and armed actors, different types of interactions between armed actors, different manifestations of violence and conflict mean that territory has very much at the core of the ways in which peace has been approached in the country. Fifth, we're talking about inclusion that's environmentally sensitive. There won't be enough time to talk about this, but what I want to suggest here is that not only humans are at the core of our approach to peace, but also other than humans. And increasingly in the Petro government, care of the environment is a key facet of what we understand as peace building and inclusion of diverse stakeholders in building peace. And finally, participatory. And I'm going to end on that point because I think the whole notion of what we understand by inclusion and participation is something that needs to be interrogated more systematically. So in just a few minutes, because I've already spoke several, I just want to talk you through a few of these key features of the approach to inclusion. So I mentioned first, it's victim-centered. So although reparation of millions of registered victims of the conflict began before the 2016 accord, the peace agreement signed in that year strengthened mechanisms that already existed by creating this integral system of truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition. From the peace negotiations themselves to the work of our Truth Commission and the transitional justice system, victims of the conflict are not only at the center of peace building, but have been active participants in all facets of the process, including decisions on what type of reparations and what type of punishment should be allotted to those responsible for crimes committed during the course of our conflict. Second, in terms of gender transformation, our agreement was the first in the world to fully integrate gender considerations. And in addition to focusing on the needs and rights of women victims, Gender Subcommission was charged with mainstreaming gender equality throughout the negotiated text. The country has recognized increasingly women's participation and the gender and intersectional approach as essential to achieving total peace, which is what we're now calling this effort. And one manifestation of this commitment is precisely the formulation of our first national action plan for Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, in which, again, many different stakeholders have been sought out through different types of regional fora. Similarly, as I just mentioned, our special peace jurisdiction has included sexual violence in the study of all of its macro cases, and recently opened a specific macro case 11 to address sexual and gender-based violence exclusively. And this is a process in which victims, again, are being included actively in the process themselves. In terms of Indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples, the ethnic chapter of the 2016 Peace Accords is another innovation, I think, in terms of peace building, in that it recognizes the rights of Indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples in Colombia, including their collective right to the land, as fundamental components of peace. Integrating the voices of Indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples, especially women, in Colombia's conflict resolution and peace building efforts is a priority in particular for the Petro government. And this isn't only a question of justice and reparation, I would say, but also one of acknowledging the positive contributions of these groups to understanding and building peace in alternative ways. Just by way of one example, Indigenous and Cimarron guards, which are nonviolent ancestral traditions of community self-protection, autonomy, and care, have been held up as one alternative measure for building peace and providing security to local communities. I'm going to jump forward because I don't want to abuse my time, and I know that we're running short. But in terms of participation, and I want to end on this, I think at the root of the Petro government's approach to total peace is precisely this conviction that active participation of local communities, in particular social groups that have been historically excluded from public debate, is a necessary, if not indispensable, condition for devising public policies that are both robust and effective. I think participatory processes, in my experience, are both time-consuming, sometimes frustrating, and demand active listening skills that are not customarily in the expert and policy world lexicon. And yet, and they force us, I think, also to accept that consensus is not always possible, but that actually, when we actually do seek out genuine inclusion, we have to accept the eventuality that incommensurability in our views of peace may be an actual outcome that we have to force ourselves to try to live with. And so beyond this, if you look at the way in which peace is evolving, and on this I'll end, in Colombia, from our peace processes themselves, to our national development plan, to our security and defense policy, and to our drug reform policy, this is precisely what the government is proposing, an active, if you wish, dialogue of knowledges in which genuine participation and inputs of different social actors into the public policy process is taking place. And I think if this doesn't happen, the risk is precisely that sustainability is put at risk. And so I'll end there. I'm sorry that I abused of the time, but I would have had a lot more to say, but maybe we can do that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing with us this refreshing approach to inclusion at the 4 levels. And I really encourage the audience to look at the pronouncement under the total peace process that the current government under the current president has been promoting. One area that really struck me is how to center in the search for peace groups and social group that has been peripherized or have been marginalized. They have a different view of how peace should be built and sustained. Last point that really struck me is about how to involve environment as a stakeholder and the importance of other sentient beings other than humans to be integral part of the research for sustainable peace and a transformative approach to inclusion. Thank you very much for sharing those very helpful points. I now turn to Saji Prelis, Child and Youth Programs Director Research for Common Ground, who will share with us his views and giving additional information beyond what we have seen on the video. Saji.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the hosts, including me in this important conversation. It's great to be here and following on Ambassador Tickner's comments as well. I want to turn the tables back a little bit to you. Take a moment for a little bit and think about the time as adults when you felt excluded, when you felt like your voices were not heard. And now roll back time when you were in your 20s and your teenage years, how you felt exclusion. I want you to hold those thoughts in your head as we think about have this conversation with you. And I have a few slides to talk you through this, if that can go into presentation mode. So when you look around the world, the countries you see in green, the median age in these countries in the teenage years. And the countries in yellow are in their 20s. So looking at countries where your populations are young, and this concept of being young is an important element that I think is being talked about in these peripheries. So I want to bring it to the center of our conversation today. And the way that people have been focusing on young people has been based on a policy panic that sees young people as a problem that needs to be corrected. And what we as an international community and grounded within local practice was to transform this concept from a policy panic-based approach of seeing young people to a policy opportunity approach. And I have lots of stories to share, but because of time, I'm not going to go into any of this. But grounded in this idea was this idea of moving away from this policy panic. Policy panic questions were, why are young people joining armed groups? What are the push and pull factors towards violent narratives? While those were important questions, we realized we are not asking a very important question. And that question was, why are most young people peaceful? When you look at a country with millions of populations, percentage-wise even, vast majority of young people are not picking up arms. Why are we not asking the important question of why are most young people peaceful? So that was a guiding question that helped in shaping a global agenda that many of you have probably heard of with 3 normative frameworks. What it also does is make a political case that young people are a political force for peace. And it's important to recognize the political agency of young people in these spaces. And when we think about these words in the reports coming post, the reports that were launched today that were talked about also, the way we frame exclusion is that it is structural and it is psychological and it's human. And that requires a structural violence itself, the violence structure. So we talk about it as violence of exclusion. And if we're trying to transform this violence of exclusion, we need humans in the center of this exclusion itself. Across the world, we looked at barriers that young people face from social, cultural, political. This is in order from around the world how young people rank the levels of exclusion they're facing. And in the reports also, political and digital and legal came out really high compared to socio-political. But socio-political is in our families, in our neighborhoods, everyday places where young people are interacting, they feel these exclusions. But when you think about prevention, we have to also frame this in the ways, the world that young people are inheriting. And the new Agenda for Peace really provides a guiding light for that as well. But thinking about peace though, peace really is the heart of all this work. But the work we do as civil society is always short-term because of funding requirements and others. And our colleagues earlier talked about the short-termism and how to actually overcome this with evidence. So thinking through that, if we can imagine for a second, what would you mean to track what really matters to people and institutions as we commit to peace and prevent violence itself and sustain peace? And through over 5 years of research in 45 plus countries with 90 plus organizations, including governments around the world, we developed this idea of a peace impact framework to understand what this really looks like at the country level, local level itself, away from New York. Imagine you going to the doctor. Before you see the doctor for your actual worry, you go to a nurse, they take your vital signs. So imagine same way we can imagine peace when you think about a society. And there are issues around violence, around agency, people's sense of having agency in society, the level of polarization, the level of trust with people have with institutions, and investments. Often this idea gets neglected in conversations. Are investments to peace increasing when peace is flourishing? And these are 5 vital signs that across the world that people have agreed to as starting point for thinking about peace. So how do we measure this? One is through lived experience from people living in places, aligning them to align measures that are global, and understanding who the experts are and making sure that they are aligning with this as well. Because of time, I don't want to go into detail, but you can see how they align with SDGs and other indicator frameworks that exist. So adopting this is cost effective because it's not creating a whole new ecosystem and infrastructure for collecting data. They build off of existing mechanisms itself. But at the heart of this exclusion, this idea of transforming exclusion is about making people feel seen, making people feel heard, and their work acknowledged and recognized. The sense of being seen and heard is a very powerful thing. Even violent groups do much better than civil society groups oftentimes. So we can adopt from that and think about this, what does that mean to this? And at the heart of this spirit is how to strengthen the relationship between state and society. Earlier, we talked about a whole of society approach. The whole of society approach requires the state-society relations to be humanized and other partners coming in. So we developed a proof of concept about how young people are building peace in their communities and sustaining it. And we found that for every $1, there's a $5 to $10 return on investment. Obviously, the return on investment is greater towards young people. This was a proof of concept in Kenya. But we also know that women's group benefits, religious actors benefit, but more importantly, the private and government benefits economically and socially when we invest in young people as partners in peace itself. So what this really means is we have a better understanding of what peace means to people and institutions, and people are living in conflict are having an opportunity to see themselves as part of shaping that peace architecture that will sustain. And we actually have an opportunity then to think over time what impact means and prioritizing impact as a way to think about peace also. That I'd love to be part of this conversation and really appreciate you giving me a chance to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Eloquently said, and even shorter than the time allotted. Much appreciated. I think there are very powerful messages. I'll just pick 2 of them. One of them is that young people have political agency for peace. They can be powerful force in influencing the peace architecture. I am intrigued by this peace impact framework that you just touched upon, and how to measure the peace. I think one final takeaway for me is that peace is about relations. Being heard and seen is one way of improving the quality of that relation, particularly between state and society. Thank you for that. Before I make my own comments, I'd like to see if there are any questions from our virtual audience or people that are here. Please, Vanessa, if you could give Vanessa the microphone.
Much. My name is Vanessa Wyeth. I'm at UNICEF. I wanted to thank all of the presenters for the day, but particularly this panel for highlighting, the lived experience of of people and communities who live with violence and different forms of violence. It has struck us in the last decade or so that our own, with the kind of fragmentation and proliferation of non-state armed groups of all flavors, that the way the UN security pillar has responded has itself become quite fragmented. And we have counterterrorism and PVE actors. We have stabilization with no definition. And, as UNICEF, we have very deep discomfort with some of these approaches. And so as a result, I think we're not necessarily, doing as much as we can do, and particularly as the humanitarian and development sector. And it comes back to the point that I can't remember who made the point in the first panel, but that you really have to put human rights at the center of our approaches, and really the experience of victims of violence and people who live in contexts where human rights violations are being committed by all manners of armed groups, including state forces, and how that is different across different communities in a country. And that if we start with that as the way we enter, as our point of entry in engaging with communities and for UNICEF with children, you end up with a kind of a slightly different approach, I think. And so we're working right now to scale up our work on peace building, and we see very much as not as a separate area of programming, but as a lens that really has to be applied through all of our goal areas. There's been an elevation of it in the strategic plan. There are new commitments, there's new benchmarks, but it's really about how you take all of this great policy language and translate it into the way you do programming on the ground. And we're really starting with the pathways for peace analysis, right? It's very much about structural violence. It's about the violence of exclusion. It's about understanding, grievances between groups, and then working in a model that embeds equity and inclusion in service delivery and social cohesion at all levels, whether you're talking about interpersonal skills all the way up to the kind of policy environment. And so, these are obviously, we have a long way to go. I think everyone does, but we're hoping to learn and share from others. But, I guess my question to the panel is, how do we bring back some of these approaches together and bring the peace and security pillar a little bit together, so that as we engage across the HDP nexus, we kind of aren't missing whole categories of violent conflict, or whether it's called armed conflict or not, the violence that we need to be addressing. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other?
Thanks, Kavitha Desai with the Quaker UN office. I have a question for Ambassador Tickner. I'm just curious how some of these inclusive approaches have been socialized. Like, has there been any pushback on the programs to kind of elevate Indigenous issues or Afro-descendant challenges, and what's been done at more towards a local level to socialize these approaches and get support from either local level government officials or other stakeholders?
Thank you. One last, yes.
Thank you very much. It's not a question per se, but like someone on the ground, what we have discovered about youths, especially in Cameroon, is that the youths are not aware of the youth peace and security. And so we have started doing a kind of sensitization. We call it localization. So we localize it in our regions. And another thing that we did was we brought in some youths, some women, and we did a kind of analysis on dividers and connectors. So the youths will identify what divides them and then what connects them. So we try to start turning the dividers into connectors so that we build a kind of strong team for the youths also to know that, and we also carry out advocacy with the government. For example, what the UNDP is doing now on the presidential plan reconstruction, we've insisted that youths should be at the forefront when it comes to certain works done within their localities. They should prioritize youths and women. And I think that is also working. So we should look at what divides first, the youths. And then we try to convert the dividers into connectors. I think that will help. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any questions coming out from the virtual audience. So basically, the two questions that have been asked, one specifically addressed to you, Ambassador, which is how do you socialize these conclusive approaches? And the sister from Cameroon may have given initial element. The other question that I'll pose to both of you is that we have seen a tapestry of alternative or a tapestry of new approaches to building peace. How do we bring them together? That would be my way of summarizing these two interventions. Ambassador, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay. Thank you. I identified 4 questions. I'm going to try to answer the 2. I was rushed at the end. I think the whole question of structural violence and structural sources of conflict and violence is obviously fundamental. It's impossible to talk about peace if we don't address the structural roots of conflict and violence. And yet, and this is more a constructive critique of the Pathways study, I don't necessarily see enough emphasis on structural logics rooted in colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and neoliberal capitalism. And these are tough questions, obviously, but unless we address these structural causes of exclusion and violence, discrimination and whatnot, it's quite difficult then to talk about inclusion and how we're going to go about building lasting and sustainable peace if the situation remains intact, structurally speaking. So this leads me kind of to just a second observation about how we bring all of this together. I'm going to promote the idea, at least as a concept, of total peace as it's being developed by the Petro government. How this plays out in practice, I admit, is a completely different issue. But conceptually speaking, the notion of total peace actually does tie together the need to address violent conflicts with all different types of violent non-state actors. Controversial, it is, but it's a fact of life in many parts of the world, as we heard in the first panel, that not only insurgent groups, but also increasingly in regions such as mine, criminal organizations are the main cause of conflict and violence. So that's kind of the first component. The second component is a human security lens. You mentioned security, Vanessa, as a way to go about addressing the security component. We also heard in the first panel that many governments revert to repressive and militarized strategies as a tool of security and peace, affecting largely those very populations that are vulnerable in the first place. So human security is a broader lens than the one provided by the UN, but it's kind of another component of total peace. And I would say a third component is the structural one, providing I would call it in Spanish, vida digna, providing sources of dignified livelihood to diverse social groups that have normally not had access to them. And this includes, again, recognition that the land has been, and access to the land is a fundamental part of many populations' source of livelihood and well-being. And this kind of leads to the whole notion that other than human actors have to be a part of this equation. I'm just going to say one more thing now in response to the question. How have these programs been socialized, and has there been pushback? There's been a ton of pushback by the opposition. Just the whole notion of restorative justice is tremendously controversial. Not sending perpetrators of war crimes to jail is very unacceptable for many sectors of society. Interestingly, it's victims groups that are most accepting and promoting of this alternative, as they recognize in this type of justice a means of creating lasting peace. So this is kind of one way in which socialization takes place, even through victims organizations, our Truth Commission and whatnot, trying to explain the benefits of a restorative justice and peace building lens. Many of the activities being done in what I've described as kind of inclusive, participatory public policy processes have been taking place very actively in different regions of the country at the local level. And this is another way in which this whole program is being socialized. But undoubtedly, there's many sources of opposition to this. But that's how I guess I would answer your question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's okay. David, please.
Sure, just to build off of Ambassador's comments, I think with the video highlighted one key point. One was conflict is inevitable, but violence is not. So that's for me is one starting point. The second, I think, in the ambassador's remarks as well was highlighted that we see this as intergenerational, with conflict, violence intergenerational, structural, and also intersectional, and there was an environmental. So what does that really look like at a country level when you bring societies together to think about stitching together the fabrics that have been ripped apart? That requires a new way to think of relationships of trust. So that to connect to that is also this idea of being participatory, and that was mentioned as well. But how can you do participatory when the powers are unequal between indigenous populations, age groups, and others? You have to think of this in a very different way. And also institutional, when you bring UN actors alongside regional actors and civil society and youth groups and women's groups who make very different levels of funding, there's also power there too. So thinking about bringing people together is nice conceptually, but how do you do that when you have to equalize power? So think through that. But a model that I can throw out is this idea of a collective impact approach. A collective impact approach for Vanessa's question of how to bring people together. So people across agencies and people, institutions and people feel that the impact is shared across, not just the government, not just in a UN agency or international NGO, but how does the own, so underneath that is a sense of ownership. The ownership has to be shared across, not just one institution saying, oh, look what Search for Common Ground did. That model doesn't work anymore, even for a UN agency to take credit for this. And the last thing I think is financing it. We have to start thinking of financing in a much better way, whether it's assessed funding or voluntary funding through the PPF funds. The Youth Promotion Initiative has been a really innovative way of thinking about financing these models that are different from the traditional mechanisms. But we need to be much more flexible, as Kavita mentioned, and long-term. We cannot have short-term programs to take care of historically rooted intergenerational challenges in a short-term basis. We have to think differently about financing that. And this is where the IFIs and others are important to think of bringing to the table for it.
Thank you very much. Our time more than up. I had 3 ideas I want to share with you. I will only mention one. And basically to build up on what we have heard, that in order to address the structural causes of exclusion, we need to revisit the assumption informing our understanding of fragility and resilience. They are a little bit outdated. Let me just mention fragility. We don't have time to address resilience. The use of fragility as a policy framework, particularly by the IFIs and the liberal peacebuilding enterprise in general, tends to obscure, in my view, the colonial and post-colonial foundations of present-day political system we judge as failing or fragile. More importantly, such a discourse tends to marginalize indigenous peace systems, as we have heard, that enable some societies under stress to be anti-fragile, which is different from resilience. Anti-fragile means there are certain societies that tend to thrive as a result of stress and shocks. And this is different from resilience, which is we're not trying to restore the norms, but to transform them and go beyond. And so I would recommend for those who are looking at lessons for what should we do differently 5 years from now, is to revisit our understanding of resilience and explore the understanding of anti-fragility. And if you want to look at one example of anti-fragility in West Africa, Niger is an example. And the report of the World Bank and the the Pathway for Peace devotes a whole section on Niger. but unfortunately from the lens of fragility and resilience, instead of from the lens of anti-fragility. Thank you very much. Our time is up. Please help me say thank you to our speakers. Thank you.
Time is up for this panel, but you are not released from custody here at IPI. We have a few closing remarks, closing reflections really on what's been a really robust, substantive conversation of both of these panels. So thank you so much for sticking around. First, we'll have, we are grateful to have Asif Khan here today, Director of Policy and Mediation Division of the United Nations Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs. There's been sort of behind a lot of these conversations, anticipation of the new agenda for peace that is coming. And I know Asif will address that. Then we'll have virtually Frank Bousquet, Deputy Director of Fragile and Conflict Affected States from the IMF, who will give us a brief remarks. And then we'll come back to the ASG, Elizabeth Spehar, for final remarks. Asif, please, the floor is yours. Yeah.
But very nice to see you, and thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks Madeline also for inviting. I would like to start by saying that, of course, we welcome this discussion. We also are hugely impressed with the Pathways for Peace report when it came out. It is an influential document for us. It's mobilized donors, but it's also, I think, formed and shaped quite a bit of our thinking as we've tried to draft the policy brief on a new agenda for peace, which, as you know, is still not out, but will be out soon. So very much in the last leg. But I wanted to start, just make a few comments by first acknowledging that since the report came out, since Pathways for Peace came out, there have been, of course, major tectonic shifts. There have been new geopolitical rifts, not because they weren't there before, but they've certainly become much worse and have deepened. And so, of course, these changes have affected our work and also the type of approaches that the Pathways for Peace report envisages. First and foremost, of course, conflict landscape is continuing to evolve as we speak, even over the weekend. Civil wars are more internationalized and harder to resolve. Interstate wars are making a resurgence. The prevention challenge, of course, has become more complex, not because it wasn't before, but it's certainly even more complicated now. And we think that this is also fundamentally due to a lack of trust. It is evident today that beyond the core divisions between East and West, we are seeing a global South where much of the work Pathways envisages should take place or takes place that is increasingly skeptical of international institutions such as the UN and the World Bank, which in their view have served the interests of a smaller group of states, but not their own. So if we want to succeed in addressing this challenge, we must carry out, of course, a serious self-reflection, which is something that we've tried to do in the process for New Agenda for Peace. Really try and examine how we can rebuild this trust. At the micro level, this puts an onus on all of us involved in policy exercises such as Pathways to work on a more inclusive basis. So thank you very much for the interesting discussion that preceded this, but also to represent a wider set of voices and concerns. But more broadly, we must think of the ways we have approached mandates such as prevention and how we can dispel the perception of bias that often surrounds them. A new agenda for peace will seek to tackle this issue head on. It will call for a universal approach to prevention, whereby every member state recognizes it faces its own set of risks of violence or conflict. So just a sidebar on this, we feel that the focus on fragile countries has often not helped overcome the political challenge of prevention, and has sometimes aggravated the perception that prevention only applies to a subset of countries. While the magnitude of risks may change from one country to the next, it's undeniable, of course, there has to be a recognition that all of them face risks. And I think this would help address the perception of selectivity. What is a universal approach to prevention? I think in our views, it requires two parallel steps. First, we must move beyond addressing conflict-related violence to addressing other forms of violence. Nothing new here. This is already in SDG 16.1, contains this commitment. We think that this issue has grown only more salient since the 2030 agenda was adopted. So for instance, and I think you know a lot of this, from 2015 to 2021, organized crime was responsible for as many deaths as all armed conflicts combined. Countries in Central America's Northern Triangle have higher rates of violent deaths than many civil wars. So we have different forms of violence against migrants, against LGBTQI plus communities, racial minorities. These different forms of violence are global in nature and are not restricted to conflict-affected countries. And I should, of course, add domestic violence, which is a huge part of this as well. A more comprehensive approach to violence, in our view, will make our prevention work more credible. It also requires that we move our focus beyond horizontal inequalities, which were the focus of pathways. These are critical, but not the only factor we should address. We need to more systematically tackle broader injustices and inequalities at the global as well as at the national level. So even if they're not correlated with identity factors. So vertical inequalities are a crucial factor to explain violence related to homicides and organized crime, for example. And of course, it leads us to a more serious discussion of economic policies at the national level, but also internationally. And so, of course, I reference here the Secretary General's policy brief on the international financial architecture and its reform. Secondly, universality in prevention must be accompanied by shifting the focus to national prevention and peace building capacities and infrastructures for peace, and on the need to invest seriously in them. There is no alternative to recognizing the national actors have the most powerful levers to address drivers of conflict and violence and must be the main agents for effective prevention. This does not mean, of course, that governments should act on their own. Effective prevention requires whole of society approaches, but it is hard to envisage effective prevention when national governments do not buy in. So a new agenda for peace is mostly directed at governments, but not only, but they are a major part, of course, of the solution. So let me address the role of the Peacebuilding Commission here. And I see Elizabeth is listening carefully, and she's heard this from me before, but many member states have expressed an interest in seeing a stronger role for the PBC. The PBC is uniquely placed to encourage a cross-pillar engagement on prevention and peace building, and to offer advice to other intergovernmental bodies like the Security Council, ECOSOC, or the Human Rights Council. The PBC also has an unfulfilled potential in helping mobilize resources that can help us back up our actions with concrete investments at the national level in support of national priorities. A new agenda for peace will make recommendations in this regard, which we hope, because of course it's up to member states, we hope the Summit of the Future in 2024 can support, as well as the 2025 review of the peace building architecture that's coming up. So, you know, for us, we're looking forward to the reaction of member states, of IFI partners, of civil society when the policy brief is issued. And from our perspective, there are two fundamental objectives we have sought to achieve. First, to find ways to encourage member states to move away from a logic of competition, to embrace cooperation towards shared interests and benefits, and to address common threats. Second, to show ways in which we can adapt and update our collective approaches in order to help chart a more inclusive path through these uncertain times, while still being guided by the Charter and our normative frameworks. Thank you.
So first, thank you very much. Thank you for the First International Peace Institute for hosting this event. I see Elizabeth Spea, who is also spearheading this initiative and really drawing the attention on this report, trying to focus on the update, but also operationalization in terms of concrete action. And I would like to thank her and recognize her leadership on this one. Obviously, I'm very biased on this report. since I was co-chairing with Oscar Fernandez Taranco, the steering committee overseeing this report 5 years ago already. So I would like again to thank the joint UN and World Bank team. I see Ian Hank in the room, but of course I think about Alexandre, Mark, Benjamin, I mean, so many colleagues that have been working hard. And I have to say, for the first ever UN World Bank report, the transaction cost was quite significant. I'm not sure I will be ready to do it again, but what is important is that actually many messages, and I will now focus on that, are still relevant today and are more important than ever indeed. So I would like to focus on 2 points. First, we heard today, since it's the concluding sessions, let me try to summarize some of the points that I thought were quite important about what has changed in terms of the fragility and conflict landscape. One aspect is obviously we see a world more and more with more polycrisis. I think we heard that from Ambassador Ahmed Abdelatif, who is always right, raising the attention on COVID, on the debt. Let's not forget that today 3/4 of fragile and conflict-affected states are either in high risk of debt distress or in debt distress. So this is really worsening in terms of inflation, in terms of refugee. We heard from UNHCR 110 million people, world record. So all that to say what? It means that in this polycrisis environment, obviously looking at prevention is more challenging because it makes the case, but it also makes the case for collaboration across organizations with different mandates more important than ever. So I remember that time of the Pathway for Peace, but also of the first ever World Bank strategy on fragility and conflict, we're making the point about working across silo, humanitarian, peace, security actors. And actually today it's even broader. If you don't bring experts on climate change, if you don't bring experts looking at so many other aspects of this polycrisis, it's going to be missing a piece. So the whole point about collaboration, it's not nice just on a piece of paper, but it's actually today becoming even more crucial because all the risks that were already contained in the initial 2018 report are materializing. That's one aspect. Second point about fragmentation. When I talk about what has changed over the past few years, obviously we live in a world more and more fragmented. Russian war in Ukraine, all the related sanctions, the increased use of trade restrictions are driving fragmentation scenario. And who is the most impacted? Guess what? Low-income countries, fragile and conflict-affected states. So the number of restrictions on trade and foreign direct investment have jumped 3 times since 2018. And what it means, that's a report from the IMF indicating it, that the cost for geoeconomic fragmentation can be actually up to 7% of the global GDP in the long run. And that's, what does that mean? It means, one, that low-income economies and fragile conflict-affected states are the most vulnerable to the effect of fragmentation we are seeing today. And that's really a worsening trend that we didn't have at that time, but also that international cooperation is actually more important than ever to tackle those issues, to make sure that countries can agree at a technical level on issues such as debt, trade, and that's why, again, this is so important to step up this global international cooperation. So those are the 2 major trends among those that we have heard today that I thought was important. The first one, this polycrisis and what does it mean, but also in terms of the fragmentation, obviously, as well. Now, in terms of concrete work for the international community, I think there are 3 points that I thought was quite interesting today. The first one, we heard a lot about do not focus on those countries that are impacted by fragility and conflict, but those that actually presenting some sign of becoming fragile and conflict affected. This is the whole point about the prevention. So early warning system, focusing on issues such as, the persistence of social and economic grievances, degree of polarization in society, level of insecurity, state legitimacy. Very important to draw on the insight of political economy analysis from different partners. So all those aspects are crucial so that we can focus on countries in the Gulf of Guinea and help state leadership to ensure that there will be no vacuum and therefore opening the space for non-state actors, increased conflict and violence. So I think this is quite important. Beyond those lists that we have seen, and now the IMF, we are using the same list than the World Bank of fragile and conflicted states, which I always said This list is just to monitor progress on a set of countries, but it's not ideal. What is very important is to focus on those countries that are not classified as purely fragile and conflict-affected states. So I think this case was made, and I thought it was important to emphasize it. The second point, when I look over the past few years, is that I see actually that this report had an impact on a number of IFI that are really making also prevention as key in their own strategy. So if you look last year, the African Development Bank updated its fragile state strategy. The European Investment Bank adopted its first. The World Bank and the Asian Development Bank had similar steps since 2020. All those strategies aim at doing what? It's not about putting more financing, but it's about tailoring the engagement in country-specific manifestation of fragility and conflict. And I think this is very important, the shift that we have seen across the IFI of focusing more on the analysis of the root cause of fragility, looking at the grievances and trying to say, what does that mean for the prevention side, but beyond. So I think this is actually quite positive. You have seen as well that these principles are also informing a number of donor approach that aim to strengthen capabilities to engage. You can see, obviously, the US Global Fragility Act, which is emphasizing these notions as well. For the IMF, as you know, we had a strategy that was approved by a board last year. Prevention is key, like remaining engaged, which is another discussion, but obviously focusing about inclusive growth, and the word key is inclusive, is actually part of this strategy as well. And we actually initiated the projects that will help us also to update all the work that has been done on estimating the economic benefits of conflict prevention, but also the type of macroeconomic policies that could contribute to the reduction of conflict risks. So more to come on these aspects. Very last point that I would like to mention, it's about the notion of global public good, which I think is not necessarily enough emphasized. Let me tell you what I mean. Obviously, what we have seen with Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the fact that conflict and fragility, like climate change, do not need a passport to cross border. And I think it's very important today, more than ever, to emphasize that addressing fragility and conflict is a global public good. Not only it's important because that's the case, but also it helps also to enhance the support of the international community to those fragile and conflict-affected states where most of the poor, extremely poor, are concentrated. So just my last point is a call for action in terms of scaling up with more grant, with more concessional financing to those countries, not only for those people, but also because the risk of spillover, as we have seen in Ukraine, is significant. And that's, I think, is a notion that should be further emphasized with more support, obviously, on prevention. I apologize for being a little bit too long. Let me stop here.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's always good to end with a call to action. And we will have now final remarks from our partners at PBSO and the ASG. Elizabeth Spehar, please, the floor is yours again.
Great. Thank you so much. It's always great to follow my dear colleagues, Asif and Frank, who have already helped to pave the way for me in terms of a few final remarks. I don't want to use the very little time we have left to recap all of the very important points that were made today. I would rather focus on a few aspects that link directly to the title of our conclusion, which is From Reflection to Action. So first point, which Asif helped me also to start making, is the confirmation, I would say, that Pathways for Peace has been considered an important precursor at the UN for the new agenda for peace, and indeed for a number of the structural changes, I dare say, that took place in the 2019 reform process at the UN. So as such, I think we really need to continue to value it as a useful document that has fed into new important reports and processes, and that we can continue building on. In that sense, Asif pointed out to some of the key aspects of what we believe will be in the final version of the new agenda for peace, which should come out very soon. That is this idea of the universality of prevention, the idea of national prevention and peace-building strategies being something that countries could pick up on voluntarily, which has its roots also in pathways, and definitely this focus on exclusion and the fact that exclusion has been seen as a very significant driver of conflict in so many different contexts. In terms of what Richard was mentioning earlier in his remarks about beyond these issues of exclusion, competition between elites, and the current geopolitical conflicts that we're seeing that have really sharpened in the last couple of years, most notably the war in Ukraine. The new agenda, or pardon me, yes, the new agenda for peace should also be making a call to action, as I understand it, for member states to recommit to international law, UN norms, as a way to address that particular aspect of conflict that we have seen resurge very, very seriously in the European context in particular. So I do see the threads between pathways and new agenda for peace. But now the question, as Asif was also putting it, is how are the member states going to pick up on many of these ideas and proposals? So how could these important concepts now be translated into action indeed? Well, Asif mentioned a few of the pathways in the new agenda for peace. One would be to see what kind of political commitments might come out of the 2024 Summit of the Future. So there should be a pact for the future, and hopefully some of these very important concepts and commitments, recommit to international law, recommit to prevention at the center of everything we do. Hopefully that will be really enshrined in that. Secondly, I'm hoping that we'll see a strengthening of the existing tools we have at the United Nations, including, for example, the Peacebuilding Commission, which Asif mentioned, and that could hopefully begin even before we get to the 2024 summit. Thirdly, Asif also mentioned the 2025 Peacebuilding Architecture Review. I hope that at the level of the UN, that process can also help us to land some of these important ideas into specific actions. There was a mention by a number of people of the need for a holistic approach to prevention and peace building, the idea of really making the nexus work and so forth. And in that sense, I'm also very much hoping that member states will look at the SDG summit this fall as another very important opportunity to reinforce our efforts across the humanitarian development, peace and human rights nexus or dimensions of our work, so that we are looking at achieving the SDGs and simultaneously by building a foundation for sustainable peace. So essentially my point here is that we do have some very interesting building blocks right now. We're in a quite unique opportunity with these current high-level intergovernmental processes that will unfold between now and the next year or two. And hopefully member states will use that with our support to really strengthen our tools and our approaches, and to be much more fit for purpose for addressing the poly crisis and the much more complex conflict landscape that we've been talking about this morning. Secondly, various speakers also mentioned that in terms of the concepts, Pathways for Peace pretty much got it right. And again, new agenda for peace, I think we'll be building on that and beyond, but that the key problem has been implementation. And I think that that is something that we can all agree to. Similarly, several speakers also mentioned the need for greater capacity development at all levels. And so in terms of action, I think as we see some of these concepts hopefully being picked up by member states, so for example, the idea of having national prevention and peace building strategies, taking much more ownership at national level for prevention and so forth, that we need to look at how we're going to strengthen capacities. Abdel also mentioned the role of regional organizations. They're, of course, also very important. They have very key foresight tools, early warning mechanisms, but they do need more capacity development. Then we need to look also at national and local level institutions and civil society groups, especially if we're going to have these national prevention strategies actually being picked up. So I think capacity development, how we're going to do that, will be really, really critical. Then basically in terms of capacity development, there's also a question of resources, and that was mentioned several times. Our colleague from the Quaker office here in New York mentioned the last year's Financing for Peace Building resolution, which was unanimously passed by the General Assembly. That was a recognition by member states that indeed there's a critical peacebuilding funding gap. It would be good to look in terms of action as whether we can unpack that resolution further and how we can actually leverage that very important member state commitment on more financing for peacebuilding at all levels and through all different channels. I also wanted to pick up on the point that Adam mentioned in relation to Pathways for Peace, and that was he said that Pathways for Peace was a document that was supposed to trigger a more strategic alignment between the World Bank and the United Nations, and I would broaden that to international financial institutions in general, so that we could work much more effectively together in the areas of prevention and peace building. And Adam seemed to suggest that perhaps that wasn't yet optimally achieved. I would say that we've made a great deal of progress in that respect, but that indeed it could further be strengthened. And here's where I go back to what Farhad mentioned, the fact that the FCV group in the World Bank is right now leading on a midpoint review of the FCV strategy in the World Bank. And I do think it's an excellent opportunity for us to work with them, provide ideas, and see how we further strengthen that very important strategic alignment on ground between the UN system, the World Bank, for that matter, the IMF, regional development banks, and other stakeholders. Two more points really quickly. In relation to the point that was raised several times by Adam, I think also by Richard, and certainly picked up by Frank about, as Adam put it, moving away from the FCV category. I would tend to side with Frank on that, and I would say it's not so much a question of moving away from FCV, because that has been a category that has frankly brought some very new important assessment tools to the World Bank and new funding envelopes to those countries that have been sorely needed, but rather to move beyond FCV for a much more expansive and inclusive approach. That's something I think we need to work on, and we need, as you were also saying, Frank, to see how we're going to bring in more financing and scale up the work with all countries that recognize their fragilities and vulnerabilities and therefore need support. Thank you. And one more point, sorry, I said two more points. The final point is that several people mentioned various areas in Pathways that should be further deepened in terms of our analysis, and new areas as well, in order to really see how we can much more successfully and comprehensively address fragilities and conflict. And so we need to see how we can pick up those areas and further work on them, both in analysis and then how we can turn analysis to action. One that was mentioned in particular was the area of climate, peace, and security. Now, thank you very much, and over.
Excellent. Thank you so much. As you can see from these closing remarks, there was a lot of substance discussed today. So I'm just going to leave it to me to just say thank you. Thank you to all our participants. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you to the World Bank, to PBSO, to our moderators, Yusuf and Rosalind Akombe. Please join me in giving everyone a round of applause. Thank you so much.